Good evening, virtual audience. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Maurice LaFleur, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so pleased to introduce this event tonight with David Weill presenting his memoir, Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant, joined in conversation by Danielle Ofri. Again, thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like this one, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community far and wide. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account, such as one we have coming up next Monday, May 17th, with Stephen Johnson, discussing his book, Extra Life, A Short History of Living Longer. As always, you can find our full event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events. And there you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves right from your home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any point during the talk tonight, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Exhale on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you so much for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past year or so, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. David Weill is the former director of the Center for Advanced Lung Disease and the Lung Transplant Program at Stanford. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Salon, and the Washington Post, among many other publications. He has testified before the US Senate and appeared before various state legislatures as an expert on lung health, and is currently the principal of Weill Consulting Group, which focuses on improving the delivery of transplant care. He's also been interviewed on CNN and by the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and many others. Tonight, Dr. Weill will be joined by Danielle Ofri, a practicing physician at Bellevue Hospital and clinical professor of medicine at NYU. She is founder and editor-in-chief of Bellevue Literary Review, and her writing has appeared in many publications, including The New Yorker, The Lancet, and Best American Science Writing, among several others. She is the author of 6 books about life and medicine, including her latest, When We Do Harm, A Doctor Confronts Medical Error. The two will be discussing Dr. Weill's book, Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant, in which Dr. Weill reflects on his 10 years directing the lung transplant program at Stanford and his journey to stepping away from the front lines. Author and critic Daphne Merkin calls Exhale a captivating story about the courage and also the toll it takes to work at this rarefied level of medicine. We're so happy to have these two joining us tonight. Without further ado, I'll turn the digital podium over to David and Danielle.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. So glad you could join us. And it's always a special thing to be doing an event at an independent bookstore. And I'll reiterate, if you're going to buy your books, buy it from an independent. And David, we're so thrilled to be showcasing your new book, Exhale, about life as a transplant surgeon, or life as a transplant doctor. And I actually want to start there because I think that the slip I just made, many people think that transplant is only surgery. But in fact, your book points out that it's not. And most medical students who start out don't think, I want to be a transplant doctor. Tell us how you came to this field and what attracted you and what exactly does you do as a transplant doctor?
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. That's a great question, and I appreciate you speaking with me tonight about my book, and thank you to the Harvard Bookstore. But to answer your question, my patients thought I was their surgeon all the time. And so my role as a transplant physician, and I was director of the program, was to take patients all the way through the process of being referred for a transplant. So I would evaluate them, decide whether or not they were a suitable candidate. I would actually take care of them while they were on the waiting list. And then the surgical team would do a finite but very important part of the procedure, which was that 6 to 8 hours of operating room time. And then after that, me and my team would take care of the transplant recipient from the ICU all the way for the rest of their lives. So it's a common misperception that I'm a surgeon. I worked with a lot of surgeons, but I'm a pulmonologist.
Now, but what attracted you to the field? What made you want to go into this particular very, small segment of medicine? What brought you to transplant?
It was actually, and I write about this in the book, when I showed up for my internship, it was day one of my internship at Parkland Memorial Hospital. And I showed up for that internship, and someone at a much more senior level, a fifth year resident, so 5 years ahead of me, which is light years ahead of a new intern, got sick on the kidney transplant service, and they asked for a volunteer to staff that service. And of course, my hand shot up and I was hired to help out on the kidney transplant service. And the first night we did a transplant, and I was hooked from the word go. I couldn't believe it. And at the time, I wasn't interested in going into kidney medicine, nephrology. I was interested in going into pulmonology. And this was the early 90s. And that's really when lung transplants started in our country.
Yeah, so I mean, it's evident from your book how much, you may have started in the field by serendipity, but how much you fell in love with the field. And I wonder if you could read us a little bit from your book about your love for this particular field.
Yeah, I've got a passage that I'd like to read. As I mentioned, I fell in love with transplant in the early 1990s. My wife likes to call it my first love. Sometimes she would call it my mistress, but nonetheless, it was moments like this that really did it for me. Here's a scene from my book early in my career when things were much simpler and it was just about me and the patient. The quiet of the morning, just before the nurses change shifts, the day nurses haven't come in yet, and the night nurses are too exhausted to move or speak. Patients' families are asleep in the waiting room. Except for me, the older doctors, the ones out of their residency, aren't there yet. The only sound that registers is the rhythmic sound of the mechanical ventilator delivering breaths to the new lungs, interrupted only by the occasional sound of a monitor alarm in the distance. I'm sitting in a chair by a patient's bedside, a young woman named Cindy who received a double lung transplant several hours ago. Just days earlier, near her end, she had been dying a suffocating death. The call about the organ donor had woken me in the middle of the night, just like so many times before. It meant that Cindy could come off our waiting list. She went to the operating room, and then after the procedure was wheeled back to the ICU where I was waiting for her. She is now moving slightly, trying to clear the anesthetic medication from her system. The lungs are working perfectly, just as I had hoped when I accepted them for her the night before. Alone with the patient, without the background chatter from the staff, this was always my favorite time in the hospital, or maybe I should just say my favorite time, period. The nurse asked me if I can watch the patient while she grabs a cup of coffee in the break room. I say, sure. But inside, I'm screaming, go, leave me alone. This is the best part. The nurse makes a beeline out of the room, and my eyes follow her just to make sure she's gone. Now it gets better. Cindy is waking up, eyes searching the ceiling, shaking her head slowly, coughing a silent cough around the endotracheal tube. I stand up and lean over her in the bed, coming into her field of vision from out of nowhere, it must seem. I smile at her, and her eyes sparkle. I tell her that we'll get the tube out soon, that the transplant was a success, that she's a rock star, that I'm so proud of her. Her eyes start to fill with tears. Mine do, too. I can't imagine a better feeling, a rush you can't get from any pharmacy or off the street from a dealer or at a local bar. No, this is different. And I thought in that moment, I could do this again and again, watch a patient wake up to a new life over and over, and no one would ever tell me to stop.
Wow, that's really encapsulates it. It was very beautiful. Thank you. I'm thinking about it. I practice primary care medicine, which is the exact opposite, right? We have to handle everything. And transplant medicine is really narrow. And one thing I've observed about people in the transplant field is they have a very strong sense of control or a desire to control every variable of the patient. Can you talk a little bit about the either actual control or the illusion of control in this area of medicine?
Yeah, Danielle, I've thought a lot about that over the last several years. You're right. Transplant doctors are control enthusiasts by nature. I think that the issue really boils down to trying to control an inherently uncontrollable process. For a transplant to go well, you have to garner and sort of rein in so many different moving parts. You've got to pick the right recipient, the right donor, do the right operation, do the exact right post-operative care. And there's so many variables to it. But I think you're absolutely right. And your question is spot on in that transplant doctors like me are trying to control an uncontrollable process that's inherently risky as well. And I think that sometimes that really works really well and makes you really good at your field, and then sometimes doesn't serve you so well.
I mean, I wonder if it's a little bit of this ideological mismatch, and I think with transplant, and I guess all of ICU care, we have this illusion of control because we have all these machines, right? We can intubate someone, we can paralyze them, we can sedate them, we can swan them, we can do all these things, put a catheter in everything, to control everything, and will therefore, solidify the patient and until they can get better. But I think it is an illusion. We have no illusions in primary care. We can't control anything. Our patients come in for 10 minutes and the rest of their life they're out there and we can't control it. And we have to live with this, lack of control. And I wonder if the mismatch, you talk a little bit about your growing disillusionment and the burnout. And I wonder if the inability to control what you thought you could control played a part in that.
Oh, I think it played a big part. And I think, the audience probably knows this, but it's worth pointing out that we as physicians pick our specialties when we're really young, and we don't know a whole lot about what the specialty is all about. I picked out transplant because, I was in my late 20s, thought it was cool, it was sexy, it was innovative. It felt like really the cutting edge of medicine. But what you don't think about when you're that age is what does that field and that specialty look like in the long run? And what I talk about in my book is that the specialty was a perfect fit for me in my 20s. Not that great of a fit in my 50s because I had changed. The field hadn't changed necessarily, but I had. And I think that it's interesting that we as physicians pick these fields, when we're very young. We've had very little exposure to them, and we say, wow, that looks neat. I think I'll try that. And I think it's interesting.
Could you talk about what about you changed? Is it just growing up? Do we all just mature between 20 and 50? And then either your maturation, solidifies the right choice of field, or the maturation happens to lead you away from the field? What changed?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it was just simple maturation. I was kind of a testosterone-filled young man, as many are that are attracted to the transplant field. But there were things that changed that are very significant to me. Number one, my father got a transplant during the course of my transplant career. So I can no longer look at it as objectively as I had before. I had seen it from the other side, having a family member go through it. And it became much more of a religion and a mission once he got transplanted. And I felt more strongly about trying to control outcomes because I had seen that, my father had gone through it. But all of my patients, there was somebody's father, there was somebody's mother, there was somebody's child. And then the second thing that changed that I think is significant for me was having children of my own. I think that, they changed me emotionally. They changed my priorities. And we transplanted some young people as well. And I couldn't help but look at some of these young people as my own kids. And I think that those two things, my father receiving a transplant and then having kids of my own, changed my outlook on the whole field.
Many times when physicians and nurses and other medical people become patients themselves or accompany family member through an illness, they get a different view of the medical world. And I'm wondering, accompanying your father through the transplant service, what did you learn both about your field, but also about what it means to be a patient?
Well, I learned a great deal. Here was my father, who was an academic physician, had risen to the top of his field. He was a pulmonologist as well. And he had all the information at his disposal, and he had a transplant doctor as a son. So he had everything kind of going for him from an information standpoint. Yet, when he signed up, quote unquote, to get a transplant, he knew very little about it. He knew very little about what to expect, even though I was around and he knew a lot about medicine. And it made me think that our patients really don't know as much as they should about the mystique of transplant and about how it really works. And one of the motivations for writing the book was to sort of peel back the curtain on, what that transplant process really looks like. What's the mechanical part of it, but more importantly, what's the emotional part of it? And I really wanted to try to get that part down. As much as I write about patients in the book, I write about family members as well, because I think that's an important part of all this.
In the book, one of the most important parts is facing up to disillusionment and burnout. And actually for you, it took you quite a while to realize that you were, as you wrote, burnt to a crisp. And why was it so hard to see that?
I still don't know exactly. I think that part of it is I had a very strong father-son relationship. I had coaches as my early mentors. I had medical mentors that taught us, at least at that time, and you may be able to relate to some of this, I suspect you will, that the answer to every problem is to keep going, put your head down, tough it out. And I think that was my response to really most problems that I encountered during the course of my career, was just to double down, try harder. And I think that attitude prevented me from really understanding what was going on with me emotionally. And what was going on emotionally, as you say, is that I was becoming disillusioned with the field. And I just didn't recognize it until very late.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's an occupational hazard in medicine, because medical school, certainly the training process selects out people who put their head down and work. You've got to memorize 50 things, you just put your head down and plow through it. That's just our attitude. And if you can't do that, you don't make it through. So the people who end up in medicine, in particular, have that attitude. And I suspect that might be why we're often late to recognize the disillusionment and burnout, which in fact is quite a bit higher in medicine than in other professions. Certainly.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. I've often asked myself, and you've read the research, and I've read the research, why is burnout more common among healthcare workers, doctors and nurses and others? And I think it exactly goes back to our training. I think we're conditioned to plow ahead. And I think that that's probably true in other disciplines as well. Police officers, the military, Wall Street traders, maybe others, teachers at some point. And I think that it does go back to the way we're trained. And I hope that there's more attention, and I think there is more attention in the medical schools about preparing young doctors for this work-life balance that I think is critical.
Well, let's take this moment right now, in history. The name of your book, Exhale, I think is very timely for this exact moment. I think some of us are beginning to exhale from the COVID year. It's been a long, difficult, tragic, year of losses and grief in so many ways. Of course, we're by no means out of the woods. Now, research has shown that actually for many healthcare workers, COVID brought back sort of that sense of meaning, but it also seems to have brought back the burnout. And that appears like a contradiction. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that COVID has shown us a lot of things about our system, some that work well and some that don't. I think that the disillusionment I see among the healthcare workers, not only is this acute overwhelming of hospital systems and the death and dying associated with this pandemic. But I also see that there are external factors that are weighing on our healthcare force right now that include a misalignment between the people that they work for and their patients. I see that separation happening where healthcare workers want to do a good job, but they feel constrained by the system in which they work. And I think it's that disconnect that's leading a lot of our healthcare workers to either experience burnout or look for an exit ramp. And I certainly hear from a lot of doctors and nurses that are looking to do something else, which I find a real shame.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of that is I think that people in healthcare felt like, okay, the minute COVID came, we all like threw everything aside and dove in 500%, but we didn't feel our leaders necessarily doing the same thing. And it seemed like, healthcare was a bit on its own to handle that. And a lot of our leadership. And then also there were people who decided to, not pay attention to public health recommendations. And that was frustrating when healthcare workers were risking their own lives to do this. And yet people didn't want to wear masks, and some, don't want to get vaccinated.
Right.
Something that I bang my head against the wall every day with my patients. We vaccinated those who want to be vaccinated. Now the core who's left really, doesn't want to get vaccinated for reasons that are, that vary, some of which are informational, some of which are emotional. But and for a lot of these patients, they're very high risk themselves. And I wanted to actually bring a question from the audience. And someone asked, what would be your recommendation for medical professionals who are experiencing burnout, but perhaps don't have the financial resources to leave their careers?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot. And I think the key is to stay connected to your friends, your colleagues, your family, your faith, to the extent that that's important to you. I think one issue with burnout, and I talk with a lot of nurses and doctors in writing the book, I hear the same thing. I feel alone. I feel trapped. I feel isolated. One thing that COVID's done, I think, and I see that throughout the country and some of the hospitals that I work with, is there are frameworks developing to help our healthcare workforce. I see it all the time, but they really pretty much are all based on the same thing: is getting help. In other words, getting either professional help, talking to psychologists, but all of them have as a backbone to stay connected to one another. And during the course of my career, I don't know how you feel about this, but during the course of my career, I think when we were younger, maybe it's just a function of being younger, we socialized with the folks that we worked with. And it seems like when I left the hospital 5 years ago now, it felt like we were all isolated from one another. We went to the hospital every day. We went home. We didn't hang out together. And that changed. I think for the healthcare worker that's struggling, I think maintaining the connections and talking about it is so key.
Yeah, and I think also to recognize that in addition to the systems issues that cause burnout, there's also the emotional toll of the medical care itself, and COVID certainly pointed that out. And in your book, you deal a lot with patients who have outcomes that they didn't want, and in particular, you describe notifying the family members of a young woman whom you call Allie that she's no longer able to receive a transplant. And it's hard to imagine any more crushing news for a family and for a patient that they cannot get the transplant. I'm wondering if you could read that segment for us and tell us a bit about what happened afterward.
Sure. This is, as you point out, this is a woman named Allie with cystic fibrosis. She was on our waiting list and she got too sick to get transplanted, so I'll pick it up there. I needed to go tell Allie's family that she was not going to get a transplant, that she was going to die, but I didn't want to move. I wanted to stand there in her room in the peace of my own quiet space, as if by not moving and not talking, I could avoid facing the fact that we had failed Allie and her family. I wanted time to stop or go backward to a time when she was well, a time when I was in better shape too. Finally, I heard the nurse say, "Dr. Weil, what do you think?" It was as though someone was talking to me underwater. I opened my eyes and blinked against the sound of the monitors a few times, my sight a bit blurry, my thoughts unfocused. I shook my head a few times. I'll go talk to the family, I said. As I came to the double doors leading out of the ICU to the waiting room, I saw Tony, her husband, and Allie's parents waiting for me in the hallway. I started to speak. She's very sick. I stumbled for the words, even though I had had this talk thousands of times in the past. I felt nauseated and looked around for a bathroom. There was one just a few feet away, right next to the waiting area. I prayed that no one was in it. Hang on, David, I said to myself, don't lose it. She can't, we can't. She can't get a transplant, I mumbled. I was seeing spots, at a loss for words. I grabbed Tony's forearm, less for his sake than for mine. I felt tears running down my face and I reached into my pocket for a tissue. I didn't have one, so I used the sleeve of my sport coat. I was trying to compose myself and could see that the concern on the faces of her family was less for their daughter than for me. Tony, this kind man who was about to lose his wife, put both arms around me, and I sobbed uncontrollably. It's okay. We know how much you care about her. She really liked you and thought you were great. I started shaking my head. No, I'm not great. If I were, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I told the family again, for what felt like the 100th time, how sorry I was, and I went into the bathroom. I needed to get a hold of myself and clean up enough to walk through the hospital back to my office. I shut the door, took off my sport coat, and hung it on the back hook, noticing the trail of snot on the right-hand sleeve. I was still crying, but I had slowed down a bit. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw who was staring back, a lost little boy with red eyes and a runny nose. I stayed in the restroom for 20 minutes until I thought I was together enough to make it back to my office. As I slowly walked the long hospital corridor, my head was down, but my mind was sure I was done.
Wow, that's really touching. When we think about how doctors and nurses grapple with their own emotions in situations of high emotional tension with patients, it's a delicate balance because on the one hand, we want to be authentic with our patients, resonate when it's sad that we are genuinely sad. On the other hand, we do need to keep some amount of composure for the sake of our patients so that they are not expending their energy comforting us and allow them to attend to yours, to their own issues. And I'm wondering if I can push back a bit. You blamed it on yourself, but was that a fair thing? Is that a self-centered thing? I mean, was she not able to get the transplant because you had made a mistake or because her disease progressed and it was the tragic, terrible outcome of a disease?
That was the fallacy of my thinking at that time. The fallacy that I could control all the outcomes of our patients who were very sick. And it gets back to that trying to control the uncontrollable. And when we lost a patient like that, either before the transplant or after, I took it as a personal failure. Like each patient was a referendum on me as a doctor and me as a person. And I would encourage young physicians, medical students, anybody who might be listening in the field to try to avoid that kind of thinking. But that is how I looked at it then.
So then you left Stanford in 2016, partly because of those overwhelming emotions. And you went through a lengthy process of rediscovering yourself, call it finding healing, finding the new path. Can you tell us about that journey?
Yeah, I leaned on what I like to call the 3 Fs. I don't think I made that up, but if I did, I'll accept credit for it. It's family, friends, and faith. All three were very important to me. But I also had to focus. I was, a relatively young man at the time. I was 52 years old. And I had to focus and try to, at least professionally, do the things that I did well, which I think has helped transplant programs perform better, and then not do the things that I don't do well. And I think that in finding that sweet spot within my own professional career, I could start to heal. I also, and this is something that I probably wouldn't have talked about 5 years ago, became a believer in therapy. And so I went to weekly therapy. I talked to a therapist about, what I was experiencing, and it felt great. It felt like a huge boulder came off of my back. I like to go to the gym as much as possible, and I look at therapy as just like I look at going to the gym, except it's for my emotional state. And I think it's really important, especially in medicine, that we destigmatize that when it's time to talk to somebody professionally about what's going on, that we do it without hesitation and without feeling like it's going to be stigmatized by our colleagues.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And I think, when I talk to medical students and residents, one of the hardest things is for them to pursue getting therapy. And so some people have talked about maybe we should assign a therapist to every incoming student and intern to have as a standard issue, just as we might give them a meal card or maybe a membership to the hospital gym or something, to, I remember those meal tickets that to make sure that you ate when you're on call. We should give them therapy tickets, and you get, 5 or 10 of them, and you use them whenever you need them. And that everyone does, because there's no way to navigate this sort of world of just the trauma of regular medicine. Even if you're doing all the right things, giving bad news to patients, telling patients they're going to die, telling family members. I mean, I think about this year of COVID, so much of this was telling people bad news over the phone, through FaceTime, through PPE. Um, that it takes a toll. Even if you're the most emotionally stable person, it's just a sad and difficult experience. And I think that having someone to talk to and having a trained therapist really matters. So thank you for bringing that up. Can you talk about whether writing the book was therapeutic? Do you go into that territory?
Yeah, I think writing the book was incredibly therapeutic for me. I had taken notes. I was the kind of person that scribbled in a notebook during the course of my career. So I had a lot of notes to rely on. And I basically drafted the entire book in about 4 months. It came out fast. And I think it was because I was so eager to tell these stories, and I was so eager to get down on words, get down on paper what I was experiencing. And you probably feel the same way, being such a prolific author, is I can't really understand something unless I write it. And whether I'm writing a book or an essay or just scribbling in a notebook, I have to write it to understand it. So yes, to answer your question, it was incredibly therapeutic to write the book.
And I think one of the things that writing offers, which A Life in Medicine doesn't offer, is the opportunity for revision. Right? When we write, we can revise, we can rethink, we can turn it over. In medicine, whatever happens, happens. You can't rewind the tape, and you can't, undo the error you made, or the poor judgment, or maybe the poor use of words. I think we often wish, particularly when a tragedy happens, that we could rewind the tape and revise the story, but we can't. But when we write, we can. And of course, if we're
Yeah.
writing nonfiction, we can't revise the facts, and that's true, but we can revise how we portray them. And one of the things that I love to talk to writers about is, fiction can feel very freeing. You can invent anything, but we can use these same creative techniques in nonfiction. You can, for example, tell a story. You can move the frame here or here. You can start here and flash forward and flash back and still be faithful to the facts. You have that room to imagine. And maybe we could talk a little bit about writing process, and why don't you describe what your writing process is?
Yeah, so I'm a morning writer, and by the way, I think that's a beautiful way you described it. I never thought about the revision part, the difference between medicine and writing. It's fantastic. For me, I write in the morning. I listen to my friend Terrence Blanchard's jazz music while I'm writing, and I basically have to write in scenes, and so I sketch scenes out as best I can, and then I go back in the afternoon and try to revise what I've written. I've had the benefit of having fantastic editors that have looked at my work and have really helped shape it. I think the hardest part that I experienced in writing was not so much um, the actual putting together of the sentences and paragraph and pages, but choosing, making decisions about what to include and what not to include. Over the course of a 25-year medical career, we have a lot to say. We have a lot of material upon which to draw, but trying to decide what shows up in an 85,000 word book is really a daunting task. And I found that the hardest part, but fortunately I worked with a fantastic editor named Clara Wachtel, who helped me with that tremendously.
Yes, I'll put a plug in for the role of good editors. You cannot underestimate the importance of good editing and a good editor. And I think that readers often don't recognize that, there's a lot of roles. There's the author, but the editor is a huge force. And my first book, my editor cut out 60,000 words, like that. And, my blood pressure plummeted when I first saw that. But then I recognized that she was kind of pulling away the clutter to reveal the story hidden underneath. And really, you often need the editor with fresh eyes to take your morass of everything you've deposited on the page and, figure out what's there and what's really meaningful. So.
No, and I think as writers, by definition, we're a half an inch from the page. I mean, we are right on top of the material. And I think what's been interesting about working with Claire in particular is how she's able to really show me things that really should be obvious as we write them, but for some reason aren't. And it's been a fantastic learning experience for me.
Yeah, and if I can put a plug in for literary magazines at this point, literary magazines are one of the places that new writers have a chance to try things out and have editors work with them. Because it's, you can't just, it's very hard to get published in the Washington Post as your first step, or, in the New York Times. And so literary magazines are places for new writers. I'll just mention the Bellevue Literary Review. This is an independent nonprofit literary magazine, and there's scores of other ones. And so, for the audience, when you think about how do you sort of support the field of writing and new writers, the way to get them out there is to support bookstores, to have a place to sell the books, and to support literary magazines that offer platforms. In our literary contest, one of our winners was their first publication. And, this is a way that they can get out there. So I'll just add that out there. And then I wanted to, when you talk about what to choose, of all the many cases, one of the patients you chose, you called Dr. D. And maybe you can talk about why you chose this book, that particular case, and maybe you could read a little bit about that case.
Yeah, so the woman who I call Tina Dahlgren was a patient of mine who received a lung transplant and did well for 7 years after her transplant. She skied and hiked and biked and jumped out of an airplane, unfortunately, which always makes me nervous. She was the kind of patient that caught my heart. She was a kindred spirit in many ways. And I wanted to write about these special relationships that form between doctors and patients. We're not supposed to have favorites, but sometimes we do because we're human beings. And the woman that I call Tina in the book was one of my favorites. She was the kind of patient that would call me by my first name. She would call me Davy instead of David, which no one calls me. I would find her in my clinic room when I would go see her in the outpatient clinic with her feet up on the desk. And she was usually had hacked into the computer somehow and were checking her own labs and those of other patients as well that were friends of hers, violating 7 or 8 hospital policies at any one time. So I'll pick up the story about 7 years after she was transplanted and her lungs started to fail. And I was late one night. I sat in the ICU at Tina's bedside. She'd begun to deteriorate from chronic rejection of her lungs, and I had put her back on the waiting list for a second transplant. My feet were propped up on her chair as I stared at the bedside monitor. Tina was heavily sedated, her nurse working quietly on the computer in the corner of the room. I was glad. I didn't feel like talking. Tina had become increasingly sick in recent weeks. And as I sedated her to put her back on the mechanical ventilator, I whispered in her ear, "Not a problem, kiddo. I got this. Piece of cake. One set of new lungs coming right up." In her typically blunt way, she had told me she was dying like a dog. She actually injected something before a dog, but I'm not going to say that. It's a family hour. And she was, and she knew it, and I knew it. As I sat by her bedside, the nurses on our team would periodically come by and ask me if she was still a candidate for transplant, and all I could do was stare blankly ahead. I loved Tina like a daughter, and I hadn't been able to accept that my favorite patient wasn't going to make it. I had subconsciously decided that if I said Tina was still eligible for a transplant, then she was. And if she was, we could still save her. It was time to have a discussion with her family about the details of the end of her life, but instead, I had spent my time scrambling to get her relisted for another transplant. I'd known it was a long shot, and as I sat there in the white ICU, watching Tina slowly die, it was clear that we would not find her donor lungs in time. She was far too sick, so it was time to say goodbye. "Come on, David," I could hear Tina say in my head. "Do something." "Doesn't it look like I'm trying?" I replied to the voice in my head. "I'm not God." I found my internal monologue was simultaneously explaining my position and begging for her forgiveness. "Not God? That's pretty clear." I could almost hear Tina's high-pitched, nearly maniacal laugh, and imagined her red hair flying as her body convulsed. I smiled. "Tina, you're killing me. You and all the others like you." "More like you're killing us," I imagined her saying. Tina always got the last word. I stood up and went to the bedside. I touched her face and it felt cool. Not as cold as a dead person, but not as warm as someone fully alive either. I leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Dr. D, sorry," I said so softly that even the nurse couldn't hear me. Tears came to my eyes. It was time to go talk to her parents. I called one of her nurses and told her to take Tina off the wait list. It was the official end of Tina's rope, and I was the one that had to cut it. It was time to face the fact that she was too far gone. It was also time for me to face some facts about my career. Continuing to do this work the way I was doing it was not sustainable. I needed to get off the merry-go-round. I just didn't know how. I didn't think I could stop myself. Transplant was my duty, my responsibility, and what I was trained and programmed to do. It was hard to imagine leaving my post, but I needed to find a graceful exit, an elegant off-ramp that would satisfy my need for a tidy conclusion. One way or another, I wanted off. That had been my life for nearly 20 years. That was enough. For me, the job was no longer a pure and simple exercise in rationality. I had mastered the mechanics of being a transplant doctor. That was the easy part. But now, from an emotional standpoint, every wife was my wife, every child was my child, and every father was my father, and I needed to save them all.
Wow, that's really touching. We have a couple of questions that I'm going to read them together because I think the answer may overlap. And one person writes, is there something in the training for medical professionals that leads them to put the blame on themselves for everything that you describe? Someone else wrote, someone else who happens to be a senior fellow applying for transplant fellowships this coming summer, is concerned about the issue of transplant surgeons burning out, what advice you might have for someone going into that field. And a third person asks about your advice for individuals, not just medical professionals, to help moderate the impulses that lead one to a place where he or she is consumed by their profession.
Yeah, I think it's all about understanding going in that we have limits as human beings, that we need not to expect so much of ourselves. And I think that if I had simply been told that or thought that early in my career, I think I'd probably still be practicing transplant medicine. I think that I went into this field with the thought process that I could control all of it. And if somebody lived or died, it was it was wholly dependent on me and my transplant team that I led. I think that as young physicians, nurses, people in other fields, if you go into the field understanding your limitations and be willing to cut yourself a break, I think you'll be much better off. I think where I made a mistake is not being able to give myself that space, that space not to be perfect. And I didn't have that understanding about not being able to control outcomes. It's difficult to know why I didn't have that understanding, but I didn't. And I think that it probably does go back to my childhood, my medical training, all the way through.
But it also seems like in this very process, you're still blaming yourself for not being able to do that. I mean, it seems like we need, where was everyone else in the room saying, hey, this is not your individual thing. This is not our team's fault. Where's everyone else pointing out that there are many things beyond our control?
Yeah, I don't think, at least in, where I worked, I don't think it was the culture of our transplant group to really feel that way. I do think many of us felt like we could control the outcomes. I think that that's true. And I think transplant in particular attracts people that think they can do that. I just think that we as individuals bring our own history to the table every time. And I think there are a lot of transplant doctors and nurses and social workers and dietitians who, if after experiencing a patient death like that, would have gone home, would have been sad, but would have gone home and would have moved on and would have said, this is a high risk endeavor and people die doing this kind of work, and continued on. For some reason, that's not the way I was built.
Right, but I wonder, does the field of transplant suffer from a mass delusion? That, is it the one institution or the entire field has this delusion that they can control the reins of physiology?
I think there is some delusion to it, but I think more important than a delusion, I think that the history of transplantation is getting better and better and better and better. And I think that in a way that fuels the notion that one day we can actually get it perfect. And I think more important than that notion is the people that it attracts. I've trained a lot of young physicians. I've been around a lot of transplant nurses. I've been around a lot of transplant teams and all over the country. And the similarity from team to team is striking. The young doctors look like I did when I was a young doctor. The teams look similar. The field attracts people like that. And I think it always has. I think what's interesting about transplant right now is not as many people are going into the field as when I was growing up in it. And I kind of wonder if a younger generation of doctors and nurses are starting to figure out that this isn't the field for if you want work-life balance.
Is the field due for a reckoning?
I think so. I think that and I work with transplant programs every day on some of these things that will make the job more doable. They'll make it more doable from a physical standpoint, an emotional standpoint, from every standpoint. And some of that means that the transplant teams get bigger so the work can be spread around. As you know, within a hospital, that comes down to dollars and cents. We've got to spend more money to make the teams bigger, to make sure that everyone is getting enough repetitions, but at the same time getting enough time off. But again, that comes down to staffing and usually comes down to dollars and cents.
So I want to switch the conversation a bit. We've had a couple of questions about donors. So someone wrote in, is there anyone that you wouldn't want to receive tissues or organs from? Anyone you wouldn't want to donate them to? So can you talk a bit about who should be donating, who should be receiving? How should we think about this?
Yeah, I mean, from an organ donor standpoint, there's certain criteria that each organ has to determine who is and who is not a donor. I would encourage everyone listening to become an organ donor, to tell their loved ones that they'd like to donate in the event of their passing, to tell the DMV in some states that that's what they'd like to do. Remember, each organ donor can save 8 lives. And I think it's critical that we increase organ donation throughout the country. Right now, on any given night, if you ask a group of people to be organ donors that have had, or you ask their family, only about half will agree to donate. Half don't give consent. And so I think there's still a segment of the population that, even though they're brain dead, even though they can't use their organs anymore, don't donate. But to answer the question, there's certain criteria. Usually age is part of it. Mostly it's less than 65 years for most of the organs. Some general degree of health with the particular organ, and we have a variety of ways to measure the quality of the organs. But I think the first step is to become an organ donor.
So what do you think about the reverse process? I remember Israel was experimenting with the idea of everyone is an organ donor unless you opt out.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I'm a big fan of it. In fact, there's a few countries that have actually tried it other than Israel, and organ donation's gone way up. It's the opt-in versus opt-out, and I think that Americans certainly have and we've seen that with the COVID crisis, that they a libertarian streak, personal liberty kind of streak in them, and they don't want to be told what to do. I think we've seen that throughout the COVID crisis. But I think with regard to organ donation, the idea that you will become an organ donor unless you decide not to, I think is very attractive to me as a transplant physician, certainly. But I think it's in the public interest to do so, given the number of people. There's 120,000 people waiting on organs tonight.
Right, which means 120,000 families, multiply that times 10 of the people who are all on edge waiting for that. And I think if people really start talking, to each other, they'll recognize that almost everyone knows someone who's been impacted by organ donation, either donating, waiting for it, not getting it. Although we look at organ donation as this very niche field, it's actually quite common. And so I do encourage people listening tonight to ask around. You'd be surprised how much it touches people's lives. And think of it, how often in this world you get a chance to save 8 lives? Not a lot of times. And here's your chance. And I know we're coming toward the end, and we'll have time for a few more questions. But one person asked, "What are some of the unexpected things you learned about yourself while writing the book Exhale?"
I think what I learned mostly about myself is I was able to track my career, not just the almost 11 years that I was at Stanford running their transplant program, but the years before that and all the way back to medical school. So in writing scenes, I wrote scenes that began when I was in high school. And that's the briefest part of the book, is kind of the, who am I and what am I? So I wrote scenes that related to my high school years, and then I wrote scenes that related to just a few years ago. And I guess what I learned in writing the book is how much I had changed. And again, you don't see it unless you have the opportunity to write something like this, and you see that your thinking's changed, your experience has changed, and it was a neat way for me to understand how I evolved.
I think that's a perfect note to end this. I will. Oh, wait! I have one more question just jumped up. After stepping away from the high speed of transplant medicine, how have you channeled the energy you previously put into your practice? Have you had difficulty, not redirecting that level of drive and obsession into different tasks? How do you deal with the change in tenor of your life?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot. I've been able to focus on things like my writing, which has been a wonderful outlet. But I also, right now, I'm helping transplant programs perform better. And so while I'm not involved with direct one-on-one patient care, I'm helping transplant programs that I think then can help people. And it's not one transplant program at a time, it's several at a time. So I feel like my impact actually may be even bigger than it was when I was on the front lines of medicine. So I channel my energy there. I also have channeled more of my energy toward my family, which I think was well overdue. I've got 2 daughters, I've got a wonderful wife. And I think that, while earlier in my career, or while earlier in my daughter's life, they didn't see as much of me, they see a lot more of me now. And I
Probably
think
more
that's
than they
been,
want, right?
yeah. I mean, having teenage daughters, I think that that's probably true.
Like, Dad, go back to work.
That's right. That's right. So I think that's been a real benefit of what I'm doing now.
But what you've described, it's as though you've gone into public health, right? You've gone from the one-on-one patient care into the public health model of how do we help large populations of patients? And we often don't think about that as medicine.
Right.
But look at the people who've been helping us navigate the COVID crisis. I mean, this is really where public health shines, and you can see that there's such a need to do this. Even if you're not at the bedside holding someone's hand or listening with your stethoscope, you are still impacting people's lives. So there's a plug for public health. And one more question. Can you talk a bit more about the organ procurement process? Any thought about recent congressional hearings about the mishandling of funds? Why does it matter? What can be done better? I know this is a huge question, but maybe you could comment just a bit on how organs come to be available.
Yeah, so basically, you've got three main actors. You've got the donor hospital, so the hospital where the donor is. You've got the recipient hospital where the transplant's actually going to happen. And in the middle are something called the OPOs, or the organ procurement organizations. They serve as an intermediary between the donor hospital and the recipient hospital. They help evaluate the donor and place the organs, and sometimes placing up to 8 organs. They have come under a lot of scrutiny lately. And I think time probably doesn't permit going into all of the issues. But the one thing that I can say for sure, and I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about 18 months ago now about this, is our organ distribution system is broken. And it's broken not just because of the OPOs, but other stakeholders, including the transplant programs themselves. And we need to think of a better way to efficiently use the organs that are available. Every single night of the year, organs are going to waste. And there are a variety of reasons for that, but that's unacceptable.
That is the most painful thing to hear, to imagine a good organ going to waste when people are waiting. So that obviously will be the, for the next hour-long conversation that you do, I think we need to go into that, but we are getting to the end of the hour. And I thank you so much for bringing so many interesting topics to light, sharing your book. I urge people to pick up the book. It's really a wonderful read. I don't say that lightly. But it's also a window into a field that most of us know even in medicine, know very little about. So it's a fantastic book, and thank you to the Harvard Bookstore for hosting us both.
Thank you both
so
much for being here. Thank you to everyone out there for spending your evening with us. Like I mentioned before, you can learn more about this book and how to purchase it at the link that I've posted in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I just want to say thank you again. Have a good night and keep reading.
Night.
Thank you.